Hello, I'm Liane Jackson, Senior Law Editor at Forbes, and I am joined today by Jon-Jorge Aras, founding partner at Aras Law and our legal analyst. Thank you for joining me today on day 12 of the Trump trial, Jon-Jorge.
Thank you so much for having me today.
And today, a key witness for the prosecution took the stand, a woman with highly anticipated testimony, former porn star Stormy Daniels, and she is key to the prosecution's case against Trump. Can you tell us a little bit more about how they intended and how well they did about tying in her relationship with the former president to their case?
Today was a very big day for the prosecution in this case because in many ways, Stormy Daniels is the star witness, from one side being on the substance and the factual background, but also in terms of the prosecution's legal theory that there was a conspiracy to withhold information and influence the 2016 election by making an alleged hush money payment to Miss Daniels. So the purpose of today's testimony, what the prosecution was trying to drive home, were really two main points. The first point was that the alleged affair between Miss Daniels and former President Trump occurred. So that's one. The second is that they were trying to tie the hush money payment, or whatever payment she had ultimately received, however it was characterized, as being done in furtherance of a conspiracy to prevent that information of the alleged affair from making it out to the 2016 election. So it's a very important witness. And the prosecution spent substantial time today with Miss Daniels really going over the details of the alleged affair, getting a lot of information out about it in really salacious detail that caused a lot of fireworks in the courtroom today. And on multiple occasions, Judge Merchant had to step in himself and limit the testimony of what Miss Daniels was able to go into and what she wasn't able to go into, because it was really starting to go down the path of extreme detail of sexual relations. And President Trump's attorneys actually moved for a mistrial today, stating that this information that she supplied was so prejudicial, was so harmless, but not substantive, not on the actual facts of the case itself, that it should be excluded completely or there should be a mistrial. So there was a lot of tension in the courtroom today, but the prosecution really pushed forward this narrative and then tied it up by saying that the payment that was received was done in furtherance of blocking it from the 2016 election.
And some of the questions were related to the fact that Stormy Daniels' payment, the payment that Michael Cohen made, was around the same time as the Access Hollywood tapes that came out, where President Trump allegedly, or he said on a recording about grabbing women's genitalia. And the allegations by the prosecution are that the whole goal was to continue to suppress any negative publicity around the timing of the 2016 election. And so this whole catch and kill of Stormy Daniels' story was part of this conspiracy on the part of David Pecker, who was with the National Enquirer, Michael Cohen, and others, and tied in again also to the financial documentation, the financial records. So it's a broad conspiracy they're trying to paint, and Stormy Daniels was key somehow to showing that this was part of a broader election interference conspiracy, not just about financial records. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Exactly. It's the idea that this alleged affair occurred in 2006, but then later comes up in anticipation of the election. And what the prosecution is trying to do is go through the narrative that President Trump and his team were looking out for anything that could damage him going into the election and trying to limit it. So this is one piece of the puzzle as it fits into the Hollywood Access tapes. Everyone knows that when that information came out, it was damning. It painted former President Trump in a negative light. So an additional story like the Stormy Daniels one and potentially other ones put together could lead to a negative picture of former President Trump. And that's why the conspiracy that they're alleging took place. That's why they started taking steps to catch and kill these stories and eliminate them. So the prosecution is working in tandem, on the one hand, saying, here's the factual basis for what occurred. And then on the other hand, making sure that they're laying out how this ties into the broader theory. The conspiracy case that they're putting forward, it's not a straightforward and easy case to prove. They need to prove that there was an agreement to commit an illicit act, or an illegal act. So there are steps to this conspiracy, and this is one piece of the puzzle. Stormy Daniels is so public, though, and such a publicly facing figure, that it was a big day for this testimony, because when people think hush money payment, they're mostly thinking about this particular issue with Stormy Daniels.
Yeah, and this case has ping-pong from the mundane to the tabloid to the salacious. As you said, there were calls for mistrial by the defense. There were admonishments by the judge as to how Stormy Daniels could give details of her sexual encounter with Trump. These are all, though, part of the building blocks of the prosecution's case and the alleged corporate records cover-up, the bigger, broader conspiracy. The paper trail it begins with the accounting departments, but they want it to initiate from Trump. How is Michael Cohen's testimony going to be crucial to furthering this building blocks that the prosecution is trying to do to build their case and target and pin it to Donald Trump ultimately?
I imagine that Michael Cohen's testimony is going to be along the lines that he was acting on behalf of former President Trump at his clear direction with full knowledge. He's going to have to say that he was essentially stepping in those shoes and being former President Trump, that he wasn't operating independently and doing it on his own, or him being the one that's suggesting these concepts or ideas of how to reach out to David Pecker and how to make these payments or what to do. He will likely say that all information and all guidance emanated from the top down to him, meaning with former President Trump down to him, and he was acting at his direction. Now, I believe that the defense will attempt to tear that down and say, you're an attorney, you have knowledge of election laws, or you should have knowledge of the law in general. You have knowledge of what it would be to step outside of what is legal or illegal. President Trump is your client. You should be the one providing him with advice, as opposed to the other way around. So I think that there's a lot of routes for the defense to go, not to mention Michael Cohen has spent time in jail. Michael Cohen is a convicted perjurer, meaning that he was found guilty for lying under oath, which I think is problematic for a lot of his testimony. And I do feel like there's a lot of fodder there for the defense. Whereas today with Stormy Daniels, when the defense moved for a mistrial, as part of their plea to the judge, they essentially said the information that she provided was so salacious, so prejudicial, so not substantive, that there's almost nothing that we can even do to dig into it and to work with it. And now the jury is going to take this information that isn't truly relevant to the case, but then use that unfairly against former President Trump. I believe the defense did this not really thinking that they were 100% going to get a mistrial, but it may create an appealable issue for them. And maybe that's the best that they can do with Ms. Daniels' testimony, who on cross-examination under the defense's questioning was sharp and aggressive. This is what we call a hostile witness. They're not a witness that you're going to be able to easily work with. They're going to push against you at every step of the way. So maybe the angle of the mistrial and attacking it from that point of view, maybe that's the best the defense can get out of this witness, to at least minimize the impact to the jury.
Yeah, because there was a lot of salacious details that came out from Stormy Daniels. And then yesterday that we heard from the Trump Organization controller about how they reimburse and log, whether it's legal payments, legal expenses, how they actually characterize and were characterizing payments to Michael Cohen. So how was that important to demonstrate whether or not there was any direction from President Trump, or at the very minimum, there was some argument that this was potential tax fraud. How important is this? Was this laying the foundation from the financial aspect and from people who work for the Trump organization itself?
The documents in many ways are the foundational key to the case. Now, whether that elevates the crimes that are being alleged from a misdemeanor to a felony, that's sort of the battleground here. So step one, are these entries that were in the bookkeeping about the payments that were made, were they mischaracterized? The prosecution's point of view is that these essentially were hush money payments that were being booked as retainer payments. So that was misleading. So that's misleading books and records, right? That's inaccurate books and records. Now, in order to rise that to the level of potentially a felony, it had to be in furtherance of an additional crime, which the prosecution has said is to unduly influence and violate election laws for the 2016 election. So looking at it from a base level, you have to look at the book entries, you have to look at what they said, and then in closing arguments, the prosecution will say, clearly, we need to know what these payments actually were, but what they've been booked as is something completely different. And then the defense will say they were accurate, they had the accurate numbers, and the book entry for them reflected what happened. It was a payment to an attorney. It was a retainer payment. That's exactly what it was. And then the defense, in addition, will argue that it wasn't in furtherance of any additional crime. But to answer your question directly, the documents are the foundation of a misdemeanor offense and potentially the foundation of a felony defense, where a felony charge, where we get all this other color in and this other information in is the prosecution trying to take the next step. And that next step is not only was this inaccurate, that this was in furtherance of trying to influence the 2016 election.
And that next step, of course, will also be Michael Cohen and his testimony, connecting all the dots potentially for the prosecution. And the defense is just waiting to tear him apart based on his background and history as well. And, you know, what's interesting, just pivoting a little bit, comparing this case and how the judge has handled the violations of the gag order by former President Trump. Right now, we're at 10 violations, and he was held in contempt. But this was a limited gag order. The judge already has assessed him $1,000 per violation for the 9 violations previously. And he just said to Trump, to former President Trump, the last thing I want to do is to put you in jail, implying that he would. How true do you think that is? What do you think the effect of that would be? And do you think this was a necessary statement by the judge to show that he means business in this case after continued violations?
Judge Merchant has a difficult job. He needs to put on a fair trial. That's his number one prerogative. And he straight came out and said that former President Trump is undermining the rule of law by coming out and talking about potential witnesses, jurors, about the case itself, about the judge himself. I ultimately believe that this judge does not want to put former President Trump in jail because it could add more fodder to the idea that, in the narrative that's out there in a lot of the media, that this is a baseless case, this is a witch hunt, they're looking for any reason to put former President Trump in jail, and look, they can't even let this guy talk about his own case, and it's a violation of his First Amendment rights. I don't think that Judge Merchant wants that type of circus, but he needs to balance that against keeping an orderly courtroom, keeping the trial fair, just, and upholding the law. He's in a difficult situation. I would be surprised if he went all the way to put former President Trump in jail in contempt, even if it's just for a night or whatever it may be, because it does add a different dynamic to this trial, which is already getting, here we are talking about it, it's getting tons and tons of breathless media coverage about what's going on with it. It would only add to that, and it might take away from the appearance of a fair and straightforward and direct trial, which is what the judge wants to maintain.
Yeah, it's difficult to maintain the courtroom and rule of law when you have one of the highest profile defendants ever in your court, and with the type of, back and forth that happens between supporters versus antagonists. So we'll see what the judge does. It's a difficult balance. How do you feel like Judge Merchan has done compared to the previous judges in recent cases? Judge Erdogan comes to mind, where there was a lot of battles directly between the judge and President Trump, and he also issued a number of contempt orders and violations of the gag order, but it was difficult to suppress Trump's viewpoints.
I think Judge Merchan is in a position that's a little bit different than the civil cases, because this is a criminal trial. This could ultimately result in jail time. This is about, life and liberty, right? This is about former President Trump, whether he's going to be able to walk a free man or whether he's going to be in Rikers. So that's what's at stake here. And I think it's pretty tight for him, and more difficult, I think, is a better way to describe it. Whereas in a civil case, the only thing that can really happen are injunctions, stopping businesses from operating, civil penalties, fines. It's all monetary. This is different. This is about individual liberty is what's at stake. So that's why I think to some extent Judge Merchan has been willing to kind of let former President Trump attack in a lot of different ways, but I think he's narrowing in on trying to maintain some civility and trying to wrangle his courtroom back under his control. I think that overall, he has a difficult task at hand with a difficult defendant, but he does seem to be handling it the best he can. And today was a good example when Miss Daniels was on the stand and going into really deep detail about the alleged sexual encounter with former President Trump. He literally steps in and says, what's the relevance of this? Can we keep this more narrow? I don't believe the jury needs to hear that. So he's really locked into this case. He's following it very closely, and he wants to limit the amount of potential appealable issues. He wants to limit any external factors that would affect this case and take away from what he hopes to be just a jury verdict, whether that's guilty, whether that's not guilty. All that Judge Merchan wants to do is help the defense and the prosecution usher in the evidence that needs to be ushered in, have the witnesses testify that need to testify, do the openings, do the closings, rule on any motions, and just sort of like land this ship, right? Land it in the jury's hands with everything that they need. So he's sort of the caretaker of making that happen, or I should say is the caretaker of making that happen. And that's why, he has a very difficult job, but seems to be upholding it. Here we are at day 12, and nothing too awry has occurred.
Yeah, he's doing a pretty good job of trying to, as you said, that was a good way to put it, to try to land the ship and have as fair and balanced the trial as possible in an unprecedented case with the President of the United States as a defendant. So we will see what happens fairly soon. Michael Cohen is set to testify, so we will definitely be talking to you more about what happens then. Thank you so much again for joining me, Jon-Jorge, today.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time.